Welcome to these three musicians, Frank 𝐈𝐍𝐅, Michael Fitzsimmons, and David Downing. Weren't they wonderful? I heard them play the only other time they've played in public, which was at the Omaha Healing Arts Center, and I was blown away by that evening, and I always wanted to have them here. And so they agreed to be part of what is really an experiment, which you're all part of, involving Keith Sawyer and this improvisation lab that we're going to do with this evening. Keith Sawyer is one of the country's leading scientific experts on creativity. And tonight's program is sponsored by the University of Nebraska at Omaha College of Business Administration at Mammal Hall. Please join me in thanking the college and Dean Loophole. Students and faculty from UNO are here tonight, and we welcome you all. And they'll be joining Keith tomorrow in a workshop here at 𝐍𝐿𝐄 and then also out at Mammal in the afternoon. Group Genius shows us how to be more creative in groups, how to change our organizations for the better, and how to tap into our own reserves of creativity. For his research, Keith studied improvisational theater groups and jazz groups. So this led us to this evening. This is really a first for us, first for Keith, and first for these guys, in that we're going to kind of open up what goes on in a group like this when they don't exactly know what they're going to do next. And you can kind of see how they went into this in such a wonderful way. There's all kinds of things that hopefully we can all become great observers of and have a wonderful discussion with an expert in Keith Sawyer. The man to my right, David Downing, is well known in Omaha. I think of him as a kind of a musical wizard. He has technical ability, musical range, and a wonderful access of all kinds of styles, and he brings them together with a kind of composer's mind. For me, he embodies the soul and purpose of music. He went to the Cleveland Institute, studied with Alan Harris. He's worked with Nasir Jones and Jewel. Please say hello to David Downing. Frank 𝐈𝐍𝐅 is a very modest man, so he didn't give me a lot to toot his horn, saxophone player and a wind quadrupler, was born in Germany to German parents. He came to this area through the Air Force and was here as a toddler, but then he quickly went away for his early school years in England. He considers himself a native Nebraskan, but clearly his influence is abroad, and a very strong German mother steered him towards music and a creative career now as a CAD designer for HDR. Please say hello to Frank 𝐈𝐍𝐅. Michael Fitzsimmons is many things: composer, percussionist, collaborator, and a very, very gifted and committed teacher. He works very well with groups, creating innovative ways to integrate music and story for elementary and secondary students, and on another front, for training in the GATE program, therapists, hospital teams, and all kinds of people in other fields. He works for the Nebraska Arts Council touring program, and his work is very valuable to this community. I think of him as an open, inquisitive, and curious soul. He's a master of all of this, and please welcome Michael Fitzsimmons. You all are about to be the beneficiaries of one of Michael's talents, is working with groups. I've asked him to help us out with something that he does almost all the time. He works with groups. And I won't say any more. I'll just turn it over to you, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Hal. Hi, everybody. This is an exercise called Found Sounds. It's where you look in your immediate environment. You don't have to get out of your chairs. Look for 3, 4, 5 sounds that are interesting to you, and just start creating sounds with those. You can change back from sound to sound if you want to. Allow yourself to be affected by other people's playing, and listen, respond, have fun. We'll do this for about 5 minutes, and we'll see if it comes to a close to silence on its own. We'll see if that works. So ready, go.
my pleasure to introduce our very special guest this evening. After graduating in computer science from MIT, he began his career working on video game design at Atari. He then worked in the management consulting field, working on innovative technologies, and then went on to the University of Chicago, where he worked in psychology and studied the Chicago improv theater groups, and worked with a very renowned creativity researcher, still alive today in his 80s, 𝐈𝐍𝐼𝐋𝐋𝐖, who's the author of Flow. He has been a jazz pianist for 20 years and currently is a professor of psychology and education at Washington University. He is a sought-after speaker at universities for his work in learning and in corporations for his work in creativity and collaboration. We are honored to have him here with us tonight. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Keith Sawyer.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I am really excited to be here, surrounded by creativity in this wonderful space, and surrounded by people who deeply care about creativity. Well, if there's one message I'd like to leave you with tonight, it's that collaboration is at the core of creativity, that all creative acts are based in collaboration, and that you can tap into the power of collaboration to enhance your own personal creativity. I'll start by telling a story, and it's a story about video games. It's one of my favorite topics, and I'm going to start by showing you an example of a video game from long ago. You can tell it's long ago because of the primitive graphics. This was the early 1980s, and this was the era of what company? Atari, right? Atari, this was the 2600 era, and you can tell by the chunky graphics. And I purposely chose a video game that really wasn't that popular back in the early 1980s just to make an example, but I'm just curious, does anyone recognize this video game? Is anyone old enough to may have owned a copy of this video game? What's it called? Food Fight. Well, ding, ding, ding. Yes, you're exactly right. I'm so happy we have someone who knows Food Fight. Anybody else ever seen this game? But, I'm happy a lot of times nobody raises their hand, and I have to say, a little bit disappointed because I was the designer of Food Fight back in the early 1980s. I actually worked at a video game design company, my first job after college, and how cool is that, right? At the video game design company, we were assigned to be a video game designer, and we were given the opportunity to work on a video game. It would take one person about 9 to 12 months to complete a video game, and basically I just did it myself, right? Incredible sense of ownership and what creativity, right, to just generate the video game on your own. I'll tell you a little bit about how it works for those of you who, most of you who have never seen it before. It's a kind of classic of this genre. You play a character named Charlie Chuck, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, over at the right-hand side of the school cafeteria. And your mission is to get across the cafeteria to eat this luscious ice cream cone that's over on the left-hand side of the cafeteria. And now that would be pretty easy to get to this ice cream cone. You have a joystick and you can move your character across the screen, but for these 4 evil chefs. And the 4 evil chefs are trying to stop you from getting to the ice cream cone. And if they grab you, you lose a life. But they can also pick up food from these piles of food. And they pick up the food and they can throw it, and the food could hit you, and then you lose a life. Well, you can fight back. You can pick up the food, and you can throw it back at the chefs. So that's actually a really good way to rack up points in the game, is to stand on top of a food pile and keep beating chefs with the food. And, if you are old enough to have played games in this era, that's what you do. You get good at it, and then you keep trying to rack up the points. So the video game designers, we would have to build in a time limit so that it would force you to go ahead and get to that ice cream cone. And some of you could probably tell just by looking at the screen what the time limit is. Any guesses? It has something to do with the ice cream cone. Yeah, I hear you're getting it. It's melting. You can see 1 pixel-sized drop of lemon ice cream coming down off the cone, and it actually does drip. The ice cream gets smaller. And if you don't get to the ice cream cone in 30 seconds, then you lose a life. So, again, that's the genre, right, from the early 1980s. And I'm proud to say I was not designing what we called the shoot-'em-up game, where you're killing somebody or you're killing aliens. This was an era of cuter, friendlier, fuzzier video games, right? And it's just too bad that it wasn't more successful. But still, it was just a great feeling to be the designer, right? And to say, I made Food Fight. And it actually was on shelves in stores, and it was in some homes, apparently. And so I'm delighted to have someone here tonight who is a past player of Food Fight. Well, I stopped playing video games in about 1984. I moved on and started doing management consulting, strategic impacts of new technology, and I really stopped playing video games completely. I lost touch with the industry altogether. And it wasn't until about 20 years later, in 2002, and at that time I was married and I had a stepdaughter. And my stepdaughter had been playing on her PlayStation 1 video game player, and she asked my wife and I for a PlayStation 2 for Christmas. So we said, okay, we got her the PlayStation 2. And then she asked for a particular video game title that she was really excited about, some of her friends had, and we agreed to get her that. As a matter of fact, I have it with me tonight because she no longer plays video games. But this is the title. Anyone recognize this? Much more successful than Food Fight ever was. This is a title called Kingdom Hearts, and Kingdom Hearts is a Disney production. In fact, as you play Kingdom Hearts, you actually will encounter Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and a variety of these sort of Disney characters. And you can tell just by looking at the graphics here that we're talking about light years ahead of those early 1980s days with the rinky-dink graphics and the jaggedy edges of the characters. And it turns out this isn't just the artwork on the cover. This is really what the game looks like when you're playing it. It looks like you're inside of an animated Disney movie. It's just phenomenal. And so, remember, I hadn't looked at these things in 20 years, so I was really floored. So the technology has really come a long way. And I actually thought, you know what, maybe some of my old colleagues were still involved in the business. Maybe some of them were still designing video games. I'd lost touch with most of those guys. And I looked in the booklet here in the back to see, and video games actually have credits these days. The screen I showed you earlier, that was the screen I had to sneak it into the game because the video game designers never were credited in those days. So we would all sneak our names into the game, and that actually was a screen from the game where I called myself the alchemist of fun. Could have been much worse, but it's for someone who's 23. So I looked at this list of credits, looking for names of my colleagues. I knew it was going to be more than one or two people because this is obviously a much more sophisticated production. But what I didn't expect was to see this. I mean, look at this list of names. And some of you will know this if you play a lot of video games, but there are over 50 names here. They're so small, you can't read them unless you get up really close. I can't read them without my reading glasses. And if you look at it a little bit more closely, you see there are all sorts of titles, like there is a battle sequence coordinator, there is a main character designer, there's a whole staff of music and sound experts, and basically everyone's name who is up here has the title of editor or producer or manager. So this isn't all, right? There are over 50 names here, but actually I looked into it, more than 200 people involved in the design of this video game. And that's typical for a modern video game title, is to have over 200 people. So I was amazed for two things. One is the sophistication and the quality, but then secondly, the amount of collaboration and teamwork that goes into making this kind of creative product. And I have to admit, I felt a kind of pang of nostalgia for those old days where one designer would make one video game, and I had, like I said, that sense of ownership, right? This was my game. Well, that's not the world anymore, and that's not the creative world that we're in. It's not about one person generating a creative product. Today, it's about groups of people coming together in organizations and structures and building things that are greater than what any one person could do. We've gone from this world where we had kind of this lone genius model of creativity where one person generates one creative product to what I call the group genius, right? It's about collaboration and people coming together. That's the nature of creativity in today's world. Whether we're talking about the economy, whether we're talking about invention, whether we're talking about scientific creativity in the laboratory, whether we're talking about artistic creativity, collaboration has increased. The number of authors on scientific papers has gone up, and the collaborative works turn out to be, as a rule, more creative and more influential than solo-authored works. So this has taken place throughout society. It's not just in video game design. The world has become much more collaborative, and creativity is fundamentally collaborative. Well, in my own research, I started out interested in creativity because of my experience as a jazz pianist. This is a typical photo of an old jazz trio, and in my own experience, well, I started out playing classical piano, and I was trained in the classical piano style where I learned how to read notation, and I got very good at reading notation and practicing pieces over and over. And I got to the point, like any good pianist, where I could sight read, and I was playing Brahms and Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, this sort of thing, right? And I was known in my high school as a pretty good pianist, so when our jazz band needed a pianist, I was asked to play in the jazz band. And I still remember the first rehearsal, and I went and got down at the piano. It was an old Fender Rhodes electric piano, and the band director put the music in front of me, and it didn't have any notes on the page, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't play. I said, I don't know what to do, and the band director, who was a trumpet player, actually knew a little piano. What the music has on it, some of you who are musicians might know, it has chord symbols. So you have the harmonic structure of the song, and then the pianist is supposed to create his own voicings and his own parts just based on the harmonic structure of the song. And I had no idea what to do. So I was playing very simple chords in that first day of practice. And then I became progressively more fascinated, and I started teaching myself. I started listening to jazz albums. I started doing what every young, aspiring jazz musician does, playing with other musicians, listening, and trying to figure out I was teaching myself how to be an improvisational musician. And it really was like learning piano all over again. And the thing about it is, not only are you improvising your own part, well, we saw this just minutes ago with our band, right? You're not only improvising your own part, but you're improvising at the same time that other people are improvising on stage with you. So your improvisations have to align with other people's improvisations. And it sounds like it might actually be more difficult and maybe even more constraining than if you could just improvise by yourself. And for beginners, it actually is somewhat hard to play with a group until you get a certain level of ability. But most improvisational musicians, we don't view it as a constraint or a limitation that we are required to fit in with what the other musicians are doing. That's not how we think about it. How we think about it is that the other musicians are inspiring us, right? They're giving us things to work with. We're having a conversation on stage. And by virtue of that interaction, everybody ends up playing better than what any one person could have done alone. So you seek out groups, context to play in. You seek out other musicians to play with. I can play very nice jazz piano at home by myself, but it's always better if I can find an ensemble and play in that ensemble, because what happens is the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. While I was in Chicago, I stumbled on this fascinating theater phenomenon, improvisational theater. Most cities have at least one improv group, and there may be one in Omaha. In Chicago, it's known as the World Center of Improvisational Theater. This is a photo of one of the groups where I started doing research. It's called I.O. Theater. It used to be called the Improv Olympic until the International Olympic Committee sued them for trademark copyright infringement, so they had to change their name to I.O. So just think Improv Olympic. If you're in Chicago, I highly recommend. They are a source of a very pure form of improvisation where they will take an audience suggestion and they'll improvise for 20 or 30 minutes. They'll create multiple plot lines. They'll edit from one scene to another. It's almost like watching a sitcom on television. It's so sophisticated, and the performance ends up being so effective that you can't believe it's not scripted in advance or that it's not structured in some fashion, and that the actors are just modifying a line here or there. But basically everything completely improvised. Nobody knows what's going to happen. It has the same sort of characteristics as jazz improvisation, where it's an ensemble art form. The people come together, and it's their interaction with each other and the inspiration that each person gets from all the other people that helps them rise to something bigger than what they could have done alone. You get ideas from the other actors, and it helps you think of things you wouldn't have thought of, and then what you say helps the next actor think of something they wouldn't have thought of. And then in a few minutes, you've created something that was not planned. You could never have predicted it. And sometimes after it's over, you're not even sure how it happened, but it's still wonderful, right? That's so exciting. So that's what I decided to focus my research on, is trying to better understand, how does that happen? How do people come together when they don't have a plan and they don't have a leader who's telling them what to do? And when it works well, something emerges out of that. And it's surprising and new, and it's greater than what any one person could have thought of alone. I think that's the key of really great creativity. That's the key of really great invention. And that's where I decided to focus my research. So I'm going to try to tell you another story now about how we can bring this example into everyday lives, and how some companies actually are starting to figure out ways to, in a sense, bottle this power of improvisation, this power of group creativity in an organizational context, so they can use that to further important organizational goals. And my story is going to be a story about a company that was nominated and selected as the most innovative company in America a couple of years ago by Fast Company magazine. And it's maybe not the company you think of, right? It's not Apple and it's not Google. It's 𝐈𝐍𝐅𝐻 and Associates. And they're known as the makers of the Gore-Tex, right? The famous waterproof fabric. So most people know about Gore-Tex, but what most people don't know is that Gore is an innovation powerhouse. They have generated hundreds of products in 15 different industry sectors. They are a serial innovator from 1958 when they were founded. They privately held still. They've been profitable every year. Here's another Gore product that a lot of you may have seen or used. It's the Glide Dental Floss that was invented at Gore. It's still made in a Gore factory, even though it's now a Crest brand. So this is the kind of product, medical products, heart stents, and I'm going to tell you how Gore does it. The way they do it is they've been able to capture the power of improvisation in an organizational setting. I mean, if the whole organization is completely improvised, then you have chaos and things fall apart. The key is, how can you guide it in a way that makes it work successfully? Well, the way Gore does it, it's very complicated, but it starts with what they call dabble time. In their dabble time philosophy, it's kind of a dorky name, but maybe in 1958 it sounded cooler. But yeah, dabble time. From 1958, Bill Gore, who founded the company, said, we're going to do this. Every week, each employee at the company will only work 90% of the week on Gore projects. 10% of every week, we'll let them do whatever they want. As long as it's wild and crazy and has really breakthrough potential, that 10% of time, that's your own. You don't have to submit a proposal. You don't have to get management approval. You don't have to submit weekly status updates. It's all your own, and it's risk-free, right? If you succeed, that's great. If you fail, it doesn't count against you. That 10% is your own time. 90% of the time, you're reporting to a project manager and you're filling out the timesheet. But 10% of every week, that's the dabble time. And that's where they try to capture the power of improvisation. So I'll give you an example of how that resulted in an extremely successful innovation. And it starts with one of the Gore employees. His name was Dave Meyer. And Dave Meyer was working in the medical products division, which is down in Flagstaff, Arizona. And in his dabble time, he had invented a successful product. It was called the Ride-On brand of bicycle cables. And remember, he's in the medical products division, and he comes up with bicycle cables, right? That happens all the time at Gore. Well, the reason why the Ride-On bike cables are successful is because of a problem that competitive off-road mountain bikers have. When you're off-road, you're on dirt a lot and mud. So you have these cables that go from your brake handles and your gear shifters, and they go down to the brake pads on the wheels, or they go down to the gear shifter, and they're coated in a rubber housing, or they're covered in a rubber housing, just to keep mud off of them. But what happens is pieces of dirt get inside of the housing, and they sit in there, and it actually causes friction. Sometimes when you're shifting, it can affect your performance. You can miss a gear shift. So Dave Meyer's idea was, I'm going to take this wire and I'm going to coat it with this sort of friction-free substance so that it'll shift more easily within that rubber housing. And that was enough of a success that it prevented that friction problem, and your shifting was much more effective. So that was the Ride-On branded bike cable, and Dave Meyer had done that in his 10% time. And now he's looking at this success, and he's got to come up with another idea. So he's thinking about it. He's thinking, you know what? Coating a wire in a friction-free, I think that's a neat technology. There probably is some other application I could use that same idea for my next 10% time. So just think to yourself for a minute, what might you do if you had a friction-free wire that you could use for anything in any industry? And how would you think about that? Probably no one in the room, raise your hand if you're thinking about this, no one in the room, I bet, is thinking about what Dave Myers thought of. And what he thought was puppet control cables. He's like in Chuck E. Cheese with his children, and in Chuck E. Cheese he's looking at these animated robots, these rats up on stage, right, playing in the band, and he says, you know what, they look really old, first of all, and they're probably controlled by these really old wire cables. I bet there hasn't been an innovation in the puppet control cable industry in decades. So if I could make this a really effective puppet control cable, we could take over the business. I bet no one else is doing that, right? Gore would be the puppet control cable. Was anybody thinking of that, by the way? Right. No one thinks of the puppet control cable. But here's Dave Meyer. So he works on it, he's doing his 10% every week. He gets to the 6-month mark, and what he's been doing is he's been using for prototypes. He has a friend who's a guitarist, and he gets his friend's old guitar strings, and he figured out a way to coat these guitar strings with the frictionless substance. And he's been trying to make this work for the puppet control cables. And after 6 months, he realizes it's not going to work. It's a failed idea. And in essence, he's wasted his time. For 6 months, he's been 10% every week. That's about 4 hours a week, 5 hours. And in one way, you could say, this is a horrible way to manage a company. This guy's very talented. 90% of every week, we've gotten good use out of this guy. And now we've wasted 10% of each of his week when he could have been working on an authorized product where we had proven market surveys and we knew there was going to be buyers for it and we knew we were going to make profit on it. And so why do this, right? So Dave Meyer, he's staring at this pile of prototypes, these old guitar strings, and then he has another idea. He says, maybe this would be a good guitar string. But he doesn't know, right? He doesn't play guitar. So he calls up another colleague of his at Gore. The colleague's name is Chuck 𝐻𝐻𝐿. And Chuck 𝐻𝐻𝐿 does play guitar. And Dave knows this. So Dave says, hey, I've got this friction-free coating for wire. What do you think? And Chuck thinks about it, and Chuck says, this might actually be useful because guitarists, we have a problem, right? You buy new guitar strings, and they sound great. You get that bright new guitar string sound. But what happens is, as you play the guitar, the sound deadens because you get oil on the strings and you get microscopic flecks of dead skin embedded in the coils. And after a couple of weeks, it just doesn't sound that good anymore. And you know what? We have to go buy new guitar strings. And it's not so much the buying of the new strings that's frustrating, but it's that they're starting to sound bad. And you're sitting there wondering, is it bad enough? Should I get the new strings now? If I could buy strings that would keep that bright new guitar string sound for a longer period of time, I would pay any amount of money for that. And maybe this coating could keep that from happening. So Chuck says, I'm working on something in my 10% time that I'm just not as excited about as your idea, Dave. So I'd like to work with you on the guitar string project. And Dave says, great. Remember, my point is that no one person can do this alone. Most of these projects at Gore need a team. You're not going to be successful with your idea, just you working 10% of it. At some point, Dave is going to have to bring in other people, and they're going to have to volunteer to join. No one's going to assign Chuck to work with Dave. Chuck controls his own 10% time. So Chuck decides to work with Dave, and Dave says, great, because Chuck has expertise Dave doesn't have. The two of them start talking. Immediately they realize there's a third body of expertise that neither one of them has. And so they go through their network of colleagues at Gore, and they find a third person that has that expertise, and they approach this individual. And that individual says, yeah, you know what? My 10% time I'm working on this thing, but I can put that aside because this guitar string idea, that's really cool. And I'd love to work with you two on this. So now they've got a team of 3 people. Over a period of 2 years, they end up recruiting 4 more people. At the end of 2 years, they've got a team of 7 people working on the guitar string project. None of them have been assigned by senior management. Each of them has independently chosen to work on the project. In a sense, the team formed spontaneously and improvisationally, right? The team emerged, and the organization is designed to allow that to happen. After 2 years, they had worked out all the kinks, and they were really pretty excited about this. They took it to senior management because at a certain point, you've got to build a factory, and you've got to design packaging, and you have to get distribution channels in place and do advertising. Well, the product was released, and within 1 year of its release, here it is, it became the best-selling guitar string in the United States. Within 1 year of release, best-selling acoustic guitar string. An incredible success story. And it's a story about the success of, essentially, it's improvisation. It's improvisation in the context of an organization. And there's so many things that 𝐍𝐅 gets right. The nature of collaboration, the way they have the incentives in place, the culture of the place where people can collaborate, interact with each other, and that's accepted and normal. But basically, the bottom line is they've been able to create an improvisational culture. And it's that improvisation that makes collaboration result in really powerful and successful innovation. And I have so many stories like that of organizations. Basically, anytime you see a really successful innovation, it has these characteristics of improvisation and collaboration. Well, I'm going to close with one final story that I think ties into what you're trying to do here at 𝐈𝐍𝐿. And it's a story about what I call collaborative webs, and how collaborative webs bring people together in not only in one organization, but in a region, or even across the whole country, to increase the creativity of everyone in that web. And the story starts, I love telling stories about fun stuff like games. It starts with a board game. And it's the most best-selling board game of all time. It's Monopoly, right? Everyone knows Monopoly. This is a picture of the very first version of Monopoly that was released in early 1935. And you may know that 1935, it was the Depression. People didn't have a lot of spare money. Parker Brothers, that released this game, they actually were hurting financially because people didn't have extra money to spend on frivolous things like games. So Parker Brothers releasing this game, and they had to sell it. To make a profit, they had to sell it at a pretty high amount, $7.50. But at that time, it was a lot of money. And they were really, this was their last shot, right? So they released this game in January of 1935. Turns out that it's a huge success, for Parker Brothers, right? But within 4 months, they had sold 400,000 copies. It doesn't sound like a lot, but back then, no board game had ever sold like that. By the end of 1935, they'd sold 1 million copies. They'd sold so many copies that people were talking about the Monopoly craze, right? The Monopoly phenomenon. And newspaper reporters were writing stories about the Monopoly craze. They were calling up Parker Brothers. I mean, you can still go back in 1935 and you can find newspapers all over the country with stories about Monopoly, the Monopoly craze. And these reporters wanted to interview the inventor of Monopoly, right? Natural. So they called up Parker Brothers, and Parker Brothers, of course, is willing to introduce them to the inventor of Monopoly. And the inventor of Monopoly, here he is, Charles Darrow, playing his own game, right? So Charles Darrow was happy to tell these newspaper reporters how he came up with the idea for Monopoly. So here's the story that Charles Darrow is telling. And again, you'll see this in newspapers if you go back to the archives. Charles Darrow, he's telling the story. He says, well, I was unemployed. A lot of people were unemployed at that time. And so he was reading a lot of novels. He liked to read novels. He was reading a novel about a teenage boy. And this teenage boy had been enrolled in a college preparatory school and had not done so well. So he'd failed out of the college prep school. And as his fallback was to go to what they called a commercial school, where he learned how to basically be a clerk in a business. So you're not going to go to college, but he learned how to balance the books and do business stationery, and he would be suitable for hire as a functionary in some corporation. So that's what these boys were learning in the commercial school. And Charles Darrow was reading a novel about this boy, and one of the things that the teachers have created for the boys to do is they've created this stock trading simulation activity, right, where they give the boys these paper stock certificates, and they give them paper money, and the boys are supposed to buy and sell stocks from each other. So they're going to learn about the stock market, they're going to learn about negotiation, important business skills, right? So Charles Darrow is reading this, and he gets the aha moment, right? He says, you know what? Buying and selling paper money, stock certificates, that would make a really good board game. So he goes down in the basement, he gets, the scissors and the markers and the cardboard, and he makes up Monopoly. And then he comes back up from the basement, and voila, right? There it is, Monopoly. He gets a patent, goes to Parker Brothers loves it, and the rest is history, right? So that's the story you get from Charles Darrow. And, well, there's just one problem with the story. It's a complete lie. Charles Darrow is not the inventor of Monopoly. The real story about how Monopoly was created, it's a story about collaboration and networks and people coming together. So I'll tell you that story, and then I'll show you what this tells you about 𝐍𝐑𝐄 and what you can do here in Omaha. The story starts back in 1879, and here's a photo of a very influential economist, but someone probably none of you have heard of. His name was Henry Lloyd George, the most famous economist that no one's ever heard of. He actually wrote a book published in 1879. It was called Progress and Poverty, the best-selling economics book of all time, translated into just about every language. And what was Progress and Poverty? It was an avocation of what he called the single tax philosophy. The single tax philosophy was a radical restructuring of society. Basically, George wanted to tax land, and you get taxed proportionally to how much land you owned. Anyone who doesn't own land doesn't pay any tax. So the landowners are the ones paying all the tax. And you can imagine there were powerful interests that were opposed to the single tax system, and it never went anywhere politically. But it got a lot of adherents. There were a lot of people who were huge supporters of the single tax system. The most famous one I found is Winston Churchill, for example. But around the world, right? Not just in the United States. In the United States, some of the biggest advocates of the single tax were Quakers. And Quakers were big fans of the single tax system all over the United States. They realized it's not going anywhere. Henry Lloyd George ran for office, didn't get elected. He died in the late 1890s, sort of sad and penniless because the single tax wasn't going anywhere. And so there was a Virginia Quaker, her name was Lizzie Magie, and she was getting frustrated about, the single tax system, I'm so committed, that's the way the world should go, and people just don't get it. How can I help people understand why single tax is so cool? So what she decides to do is she decides to invent a board game. And her board game will teach people the virtues of the single tax philosophy. So in 1904, she gets a patent for her board game. And you can tell where I'm going already, right? But she calls it the Landlord's Game. And the Landlord's Game is designed to teach the virtues of the single tax system. It came with 2 sets of rules. The first set of rules was the evil capitalist system, where you get to own property, and when people land on your property, you charge them rent. And then at the end of the game, one person owns everything and everybody else is penniless. And you play it that way, and you realize how horrible the system is. Then she had a second set of rules, which was the single tax rules, where everybody lives in a socialist utopia, and they all sort of live happily ever after together. That set of rules has kind of been lost to history. What happened was she took it to Parker Brothers. Parker Brothers said, this game is horrible. For one thing, it doesn't have a start space and an end space. Who ever heard of a game that goes around and around? So they gave her this list of 30 things that were wrong with the game, and they said, get out of here. So she wasn't in it for the money anyway, right? She just wants the single tax system. So she starts giving it away. She shares it with people, but they can't go buy it, right? So anyone who wants to play it, they've got to make their own copy of it. So actually, a lot of people liked it. A lot of Quakers in particular started making their own copies, right? So they'd get out, canvas sheets, and they'd get grease pens out, and they'd make their own boards and start playing it. And it actually sort of caught on among Quakers up and down the eastern seaboard, and then it came into the Midwest, and then fraternity brothers started playing it, and then there were professors of economics at University of Pennsylvania and Columbia University that were using it in their classes. So it actually started going all over the place. In 1904, there was no way to get a monopoly, right? You couldn't buy 3 properties and then start charging more. That's not even in the rules, right? I've got a couple of images of some of these collector's items. As you can imagine, if you can find one of these games that were handmade, and this one's from 1911, right? And it's from Allentown, Pennsylvania. And what happened by 1911, this custom emerged where each person who had made a copy of the Landlord's Game, they would change all the names of the spaces to be streets and neighborhoods in their own town. So all these spaces are streets and neighborhoods in Allentown, Pennsylvania, because that's where the family lived that made it. Here's one from 1916. This is in Bucks County, just north of Philadelphia. And again, all the spaces are now named for that city. And I like this picture because you can see in the man's hand what they used for playing pieces was just everyday household objects, like thimbles, right, which is still there in, the Parker Brothers version. And just a beautiful copy here that is from 1928. Now, by this time, you could actually buy 3 properties of the same color. So you can see they're actually colored. and then you can start charging more money. At some point in the 1920s, people started calling the game Monopoly. I don't know who did it first, and that's kind of lost to history, and they stopped calling it the landlord's game because you had this new rule. So basically, all the space names here are cities, streets, and neighborhoods in and around New York City. We've got the Bowery, we've got Washington Heights, we've got Newark, Hoboken, right? So the same custom that happened everywhere else. So here it was, 1934, and Charles Darrow, the unemployed man, remember Charles Darrow? He's actually visiting some friends of his who are Quakers, who live in Atlantic City. And they pull out the game. It's Saturday night. They have their own copy of the landlord's game. And because they live in Atlantic City, all of the space names are streets in Atlantic City. So Charles Darrow sits down, he plays the game, they play it all night. He likes it. He says, "This is great. Can you write down a copy of the rules for me?" So he gets the rules, he takes them back to his home, and he makes his own copy. He fraudulently obtains the patent, claiming that he invented it. He takes it to Parker Brothers. They don't know that he didn't really invent it. But, the interesting thing is, this is the real story about how Monopoly was created, and the fake story tells us so much about our mythical views about how creativity happens. And I love the story because it makes in sharp contrast a kind of mythical view of the lone genius with the real story of collaboration. So, for example, we have this myth that creativity is about the flash of insight. Remember I showed you the bald head with the light bulb on it, right? That's that notion that that's where creativity comes from. If we really want more creativity, we should have more big flashes of insight. Whereas, in fact, what we learn from the Monopoly story is that creativity emerges over long periods of time. It's never one sudden moment, but it's always a process. It always goes over time. We have this sort of notion that creativity is a straight path to success, right? This sort of hindsight is 20/20 vision notion, right? Whereas, in fact, you have all sorts of dead ends. In this case, we have different versions of the landlord's game and Monopoly in every city all over the country, right? And with different rules, and we end up with one that we think of as, the version, whereas in fact there were all sorts of dead ends. The same thing that happened when I told you the story about the Elixir guitar strings at 𝐈𝐍𝐅, right? He had the puppet control cable. That was a dead end, right? That happens over and over again in the history of creativity and innovation. It's the nature of creativity. And finally, we have this kind of mythical view that it's about the lone genius. And I think that's why these newspaper reporters are so willing to believe Charles Darrow's story. What could be more alone, right? I'm unemployed, I'm sitting at home, I'm reading a book, I have the idea, I go down in the basement and I make it. It's all solitude, right? It's all being alone. And that fits in with this mythical view we have of the lone genius, whereas the reality is always that creativity comes from small ideas, not one big idea, but small ideas from many people. So that's the reality of creativity, and the key to making creativity work, whether it's you personally, or whether it's the teams that you work in, or whether it's your organization, or whether it's the city and region of Omaha, right? So the key is to figure out the right kind of systems, the right kind of culture and attitudes that you can put in place to make this process work more effectively. You want more people to be having small ideas. You want them to be interchanging those ideas constantly, because it's never one small idea that results in success, right? It's a sequence of them over time. So what you need is an environment where those small ideas are always coming together, and they're always bumping up against each other. People are taking those ideas, and then they're adding on their ideas. So that process goes along over time. Certain dead ends fall away, certain other paths continue. But for that to happen, people have to be coming together constantly. That's what I call the collaborative web. They have to come together in a way where they are exchanging these ideas. You have to be hearing other people's ideas, absorbing those, and then contributing. Really, it's the same as what goes on stage with an improvisational performance, where you hear an actor's line, you think of something you wouldn't have thought of otherwise, and you contribute your own line of dialogue. And then the performance that emerges, it surprises everyone, and no one could have predicted it. And that's what happens with really great creativity. It's something that seems to come out of nowhere. And where it comes from is collaboration. It comes from people coming together. A space like 𝐍𝐿𝐄 is designed to foster that, to make that happen, to bring together people from all over the region, from diverse backgrounds. That's where you're really going to have those connections of the small ideas that build up over time and result in truly successful innovation. It's really what I call the power of group genius. And I'm so excited to be here. I think we're going to hear again from the band, but thank you very much. And so what we're going to do now is they're going to do another performance. And this chair, I'm really on the hot seat here, so that chair is for me. I'm going to sit there and carefully observe the musicians, and then we'll have a question and answer session. I might start us off with a few questions, but if you think of a question and you'd like to ask the musicians, get ready. We have some microphones that we'll be able to pass around. Are you all ready? Well, come on up. Well, yeah, that was so wonderful. And I think all of us, I can speak for all of us here, that it seems so well put together and just so perfect as a performance. And in my comments, I was saying how it always seems like it's a straight path to success, and that's the impression we get out here. So I was going to ask, is there a moment, were there any dead ends? Was there a moment when one of you put something out there and it didn't get picked up? Or was there a way it might have gone that it didn't go? Does that ever happen?
It has happened.
It has
Not this
happened.
time.
So many times. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I was thinking about that during this particular, what do you call it, collaboration. I think that we are modest people and performers and understand that we need each other. And for my part, I feel like I try to cover these guys' backs. And I think that they do that for me too, you know. So if I hear something along your lines, a dead end, you know, that I think maybe somebody thinks is a dead end, it didn't happen this time, but it happens a lot, then I try to cover it. You know, try to use it for a new idea or that sort of thing. And I think they do the same thing for me. Not that these guys ever do. They don't do much of that. They don't play things that they don't want to play. I do a lot of it, and they run with it. It's very helpful.
Right. Wow, great. How do you know when it's over, by the way?
Is it over? Oh, we're not done.
It kind of felt like it was over to me. It felt like we'd taken some directions that I didn't imagine would happen, and like the dead end. It's like, oh no, I'm not ready for this to be over yet. I'd like to keep it going, so I keep something going or something, so we keep moving. So I don't know if it was like a time thing or we just. It just felt like it was time to, because we'd been to that place before, to me anyway, I don't know about you guys, where it felt like it could end here, but I wasn't ready to. I wasn't ready to have it end, so I kept it going.
Right. And you probably know that you're expected to do about 10 minutes.
Right.
So,
well, that's part of it, yeah.
If you know you're going to do 30 minutes, would you think differently?
We got into discussions about what's a format and what's not a format, and how can you not play within a format, that kind of thing. We were having some troubles with that, and I said, well, how about if, for me, it's important to know how long the piece is going to be. It's not really. When you have these guys, it becomes longer or shorter as it needs to be.
Yeah, in improvisational theater, the way they know a scene is over is actually the director of the ensemble sits at the light board. And the director decides when the scene's over by cutting the lights. So the actors don't know when it's going to end.
Oh, wow.
So you have to do it yourselves. You don't have anyone who's saying, okay, that was a great place to end, now it's over. and you can't do it abruptly. You kind of have to gradually fade out. So it sounded to me like you all knew it was getting ready to end 30 seconds before it did.
Well, sometimes somebody emerges as the leader for that particular piece. And I felt like it was David myself, and I was helping maybe a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to ask that, David. Did you all agree ahead of time that you were going to be the one who started this time?
Just briefly.
We kind of did
with Michael, but
cheated
a little.
Well, he had a really.
When you play with a group of people for a while and you've played several times over the course of a year, you kind of start to feel it almost like the Jedi. It's in the mind, and if you're aware and forget about everything else other than the music that's going on, you can just really just feel it, almost to the point where sometimes we had moments where just out of the blue we play the same three notes at the exact same time, and when that happens, you know that it's really just working, in your body.
Or complementary
mind.
parts
right.
that sound written.
Yeah.
Even to us, they sound written.
Yeah, it's amazing. We'll sit back and listen to something we've done and be like, wow, that was, it's like, how did we do that? So.
Right. Something surprising that even you don't know how it happened, right?
That's because you're so in tune with the moment and you're really just feeling it.
Right.
Is that flow that you were referring to? When
yes, the peak experience of flow, right? I call it group flow.
Right.
When it's maximally effective, right. There's this, I think in all improvisational genres, there's this sort of spectrum from completely improvised to relatively structured and not much, maybe a little bit of embellishment here or there. And my sense is that you're trying to go for more toward the extreme of complete improvisation with a lack of structure. Do you try to avoid ever repeating the same thing that you did? Like if you played together last weekend and you did a certain thing and you started to feel yourselves doing it again, would you stop yourself and say, no, we can't do that again because we did that last weekend?
Just from listening to the stuff that we've recorded in the past, well, we try to record every session, and it's different every time, but there are, for me, you guys can talk about this too, but for me, there's things that I do relative to what they do that seem to work in an improvisational setting. But so it's almost like a tool. learning different colors to paint with. And so I find myself getting into that, but it's not like, oh, I've done this before, but I want to add this to it. This is something that I know how to do, and I think it'd be interesting.
A lot of people use improvisation as a way of developing what will then become scripted material. So in theater, Second City does that. They improvise in rehearsal, but then when you see them on stage in Chicago, it's all scripted sketch comedy. Right. Or Mike Leigh, the movie director, who improvises to come up with his scripts. But by the time they're filming, everything's scripted. So I wonder, if you're performing together a lot, and then things happen at work, and then you say, well, let's do that again next weekend because that worked really well, and then it gets a little better, and then they do it a third time. And then maybe is it composed? It's sort of improvisationally composed. Does that ever happen?
It hasn't yet, but I like that idea. And I don't think either one of us is opposed to that.
That's what we've been talking about doing since day one, right? So when we show up, we start recording with the intent of listening to the recording and go, oh yeah, that'd be something to use for a composition. And when we show up at a rehearsal is what I'm saying. We've never rehearsed.
The secret's out. Yeah. Right.
No, we get together and do what we just did, right? Mm-hmm. That's...
Right. Well, improv theater groups rehearse all the time, and including the one I performed with, and my friends would always joke. They'd say, ha, why are you rehearsing with improv?
Right.
But it was not to do the same thing over and over. It's really to develop an ensemble feeling, right? To sort of get into the groove with the other performers to build up trust. And you seem like you have that. Do you play together a lot? You've been together a long time, you said.
Couple of years.
We performed once before and rehearsed maybe 9 times, just this style of rehearsal where we just let it happen.
But he called me one day and said, I want to put this group together, and you've been bothering me about playing with me. And he said, I thought about, I don't know, you want to try something? And I said, sure. He said, I was thinking about a third person, and he had somebody else in mind, and it happened to be a bass player. And I had met David probably not even a month or 2 before that. And I said, there's this cello player that I really want to work with, and I have no idea how to do it. So how about if you call him? And that's it.
Right, I like it. By the way, you just made me think. I was telling the story about 𝐈𝐍𝐅𝐎 and how the 𝐈𝐍𝐅𝐿 guitar string team formed. Everybody chose. The music scene's like that, right? Yeah. Every musician independently decides who else to play with. No one's directing you around and assigning you to bands. So if you got a good thing, more musicians will want to be in. And I guess that's the way it is in every city, right? So what do you think, Hal? Should we open it up to the audience?
Yeah.
With some questions?
How about that?
I'm sure
Many anyone have some things they noticed while what was going on?
The first song I was following him. I was asked to start the next improv, so that's what I did.
Here, I'll address that. He's so amazing that every time he puts that bow on the cello, he looks like he's in a lead and sounds like it. Actually, these guys are something else.
Yeah, he's generally the percussive element is generally what keeps it together. Without that driving rhythmic force, like your heartbeat, it's kind of hard to really find something. So I started that, and then really after that, I was following everything he did. Rather than the other way around.
There's been various attempts at developing collaborative software over the years for group projects or for collecting ideas. I wonder if you have any perspectives on what works, what doesn't, where that industry's trending.
Right, yeah, I'm a big fan. I call it electronic brainstorming or group support systems. There's in this workshop I'm doing tomorrow, we'll touch on this as well. But there's a lot of brainstorming groups are really not very effective. People get together and they just end up, blocking everybody's creativity. So if you get a good set of software, I don't know, are you selling something? Are you an advocate of anything in particular? But yeah, there are a bunch of products out there on the market. I think they're particularly effective because of the way they usually are designed is that everyone's on a computer at the same time and they're all networked together. And then you're typing in your ideas. And as you type in your ideas, it shows up on everybody else's screen simultaneously. So you're able to read and then respond to what other people are offering. And that kind of network can bring together a lot of people in idea generation. So absolutely.
The question came to mind because there's an Omaha-based startup, I don't know if Nick Bowden is here, called 𝐼𝐍𝐅𝐎 that has a software product that communities use as an alternative to public meetings. And it works quite well for generating ideas from distributed populations. So it's just on my mind that I was wondering about other products you might have seen.
Great. Oh, I like it. 𝐼𝐍𝐼𝐿. I'll look it up. Yeah, there's quite a few out there, and in general, I think it's a great idea to use them, especially if you're not in the same place or it's difficult to get together. It's a great way to bring together a lot of people. I mean, you can have 50 people involved, and if you get 50 people in a room talking at once, it would be a nightmare, right? But with the right software, it can help, sure.
This is for either the musicians or yourself. Is there anything to be said about ownership of an idea? Does somebody ultimately take ownership? I mean, here we have maybe one musician taking ownership of when the song begins and ends. And how about, I think about Google and their 20%. Google does pinpoint, this is the creator of Google Maps or Google. This is the person who did the labs project that ended up turning into something larger, as if that person owns it from a top level, to see it through maybe.
Well, I'd like to hear what the band thinks. But you're right, Google does the same thing as 𝐍𝐅. 𝐍𝐅 has the 10% rule, Google has the 20% rule. And it all started with 3M's 15% rule. But yeah, ownership.
We do record our sessions, and I consider all that stuff our collaborative work. So all our names would go on that. If we happen to put it out there, all our names would go on.
Yeah, I guess maybe ownership, leadership isn't somebody actually keeping that idea afloat and deciding when the idea is dead, or is that a collaborative effort as well?
When the idea is what? Is done.
When the song ends, is that collaborative as much as when an idea is dead?
Yeah, it's sort of like the role of the creative director. In a lot of creative industries, there's one person who has that responsibility. And with your group, there isn't a creative director, right? You're all equal. Whereas in a lot of creative industries, it sounds like at 𝐍𝐅 as well, yeah, one person sort of has that responsibility as the creative director. A lot of creative industry firms are that way. So I think there's a place for the creative director, but could you do this and have one person be the leader?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could. Yeah, we could also bring somebody in from the outside, a director from the outside, give us ideas, which leads into my desire to keep this thing going and how that might happen. You're talking about the web earlier and how we can do that. I mean, I have an idea, if I could just throw it out there, where Dancing Man Music is the name of my company. If people could go to that on Facebook and put in their ideas about where this might go. That's all we have for now. So
this thing, and I think that your question was, how do you decide how an idea is developed within the group, right? The music, maybe, or part of your question, maybe.
Sure. At some point, somebody's seen it through, and so I'm kind of curious the collaboration part of that. Everybody, is it a group vote of thumbs up, thumbs down that you see?
Yeah. Yeah, I think as a group, the way that we work together, I think that we would choose a leader for the piece, and then with the understanding that we're all kind of equal. No leader, essentially, but we defer.
Okay, let's take this question over here.
Excuse me. Would you define creativity?
Is that a yes or no question?
No.
Yeah, it's I guess, as I'm a psychologist and a researcher, I basically have two different definitions, right? So if we're looking at one person's mind, I would say creativity is a combination that is new, right? It's a combination of mental material that you've never combined before. And for me, it has to be something that's expressed in the world. So if you have a really awesome dream, that's a combination of stuff that's never happened before, for most people anyway, but I wouldn't call that creative because it's not expressed in the world. So yeah, I guess that's my simple definition. It's a new combination and it's expressed in the world. Right. So that's the simple definition. Then there's another definition. A lot of my colleagues in the field will talk about creativity having to be new, but also having to be useful or appropriate in some way to some social community. So that sort of keeps out the crackpots and the eccentrics.
Otherwise it's destructivity.
Well,
right?
no, otherwise it's just stupid, right? Or right?
Well, yeah,
or
thing.
worthless, right? So this notion of it's like the perpetual motion machine. It might look really cool, but it's not really a perpetual motion machine. So you can't get a patent for it. By the way, the patent office says it has to be new and useful and not obvious. Those are the 3 criteria to get a patent.
To who? Obvious
Not
to
obvious.
who?
Oh, they have it. This is in the law. It's not obvious to a person having ordinary skill in the art. That's the phrase. But anyway, I'm sure we have some lawyers in the room. You mean the rules for creativity?
Or collaboration? I mean, in your experience from your encounters?
I don't think so. No, I think collaboration is a sort of basic human phenomenon. I think people are the same regardless of the context they're in. Nonprofit, for-profit. I mean, there are organizational differences, right? If you're for-profit, you have a metric, which is, your profitability. If it's nonprofit, you have a more sort of diffuse metric of how you accomplish your mission, right? But I think the way that people work together, I would say that doesn't change. Why do you think it does in your?
No, I was just curious.
Right.
I would think it would be the same.
Right. So yeah, I would say to have an effective sort of a nonprofit in a given city or region, I would also hope for collaboration. I would hope for exchange of ideas with closely related nonprofits or people working in nearby areas that you can share information and pass ideas around, and I would believe that would make every nonprofit more successful and better. I don't know about Omaha, but in St. Louis, most of the people in the nonprofits feel like they don't collaborate very well together. There's this sort of, the word out there is that nonprofits don't collaborate very well. And sometimes you have redundancy, right? You have 2 different nonprofits serving the same population and redundancy of effort. So absolutely, I think the same sorts of collaboration, that collaborative web, would equally benefit the nonprofit sector. Absolutely.
A big thank you to Keith Sawyer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith, for joining in this. And to Frank and Michael and David, thank you very much for your contribution, not only in playing, but in also just contributing your thoughts. So, who's going to start?